All right, I give it a start. Welcome everyone to today's CFA Switzerland's webinar on the US elections and possible implications for Europe. Before I start, let me thank our sponsor State Street, who support the CFA Society in professional learning. I am Nicholas Bonitz, chair of the Professional Learning Volunteer Committee at the CFA Society Switzerland, and I'm looking forward to hear about who will win the elections, but more importantly, what is likely to change in the near future driven by policy changes within the US. And first, a few words on our speaker today. Christian Takushi is a seasoned macroeconomist with 34 years of experience in research, portfolio management, strategy, and particular currencies, emerging markets, and geopolitics. He has supported decision makers in various sectors since 2015 through his independent geopolitical economic analysis. His career began in '89 at ZKB Research, followed by a role at Credit Suisse, where he promoted investments in emerging markets. And in '98, he joined Swiss Cantor Asset Management, managing emerging Asian and Japanese equities, shaping global currency strategy, and he later led the emerging market strategy at BCV Asset Management in Lausanne. Christian has also lectured at prestigious institutions such as the IMD, Bank of Settlement, International Settlement, among others, and been featured on major media outlets in Switzerland and abroad. Born in Peru in '66, he holds a master in macroeconomics from the University of Zurich and is a member of the CFA Institute and the Swiss Financial Analysts Association. So it's a huge honor for us to have you here, Christian, today. And one of my prep questions, many others as I understand, is who will be winning? However, the question is rather what will happen anyway, irrespective of who is winning. And that's, I think, at the core of today's presentation. Christian will cover a lot of topics that tend to be less covered in the media landscapes, but which are factors that will force US foreign policy to change, and which will ultimately impact us all in the near to midterm future. For questions, please use the Q&A tool, and we will deal with as many questions as we can towards the end of the session. Also note that the presentation is being recorded and that the recording will be available afterwards for CFA members. There will also be a very short survey, which we will share towards the end as well. It takes literally less than 5 minutes and is a huge help for us to know what we can do more of in the future and to offer better professional learning. Before I hand over to Christian, please let me remind you of our upcoming events. And I'm pleased to see that we have quite a number of in-person events. So we have 3 webinars in November: how to spot true inversion early, a Women in Finance event, and a Gen AI in investment management with hands-on experience from the field. Then we have the Inside the Deals evening event in Lausanne. I think registrations are closing soon, so hurry up if that's your kind of topic. And then mid-November, our flagship event in the Romandie is our award ceremony and annual dinner. So great way of networking, get to meet new members, volunteers, and seasoned members, I'd say. And then last but not least, the networking events across Switzerland. That is all from our side. Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for this kind introduction. Dear friends, welcome to this event, this seminar. I'm very honored to be invited once again to speak right before the elections. Always a bit of a challenging task, I would say. As Nicolas already said, we are going to focus on things that are rather underestimated or overlooked. Yeah, I'm sure that you're following the electoral process in the United States, so I will not repeat what you already know. That's not worth your time. I will focus on things that are being overlooked at the time and that, in our view, are actually going to probably pan out regardless of who wins. So this is already the first message you can take away from this seminar. Our independent research is showing that regardless of who is going to win, something's going to happen in the trade economic area or in the foreign policy area that will be seen as assertive by other states. and that could actually make the situation in Europe, also for European investors, a little bit difficult. And I will talk about that because I believe this is a very important issue that is barely being discussed in the media or also in financial media and the financial industry. Okay, I will, of course, also mention who I think is going to win. I've received already quite a number of messages. And, you know, those that know our research since 2015, our research boutique, they know we are non-partisan. We try to be objective, just analysis-driven, non-partisan, non-ideological. Still, whenever I say who I think is going to win, that's an issue. So I put it at the end, if you don't mind. And let's see what election day is going to show to us. I will now proceed with my presentation. Bear with me a few seconds. I think that these US elections are going to accelerate the pressures that are currently weighing on Europe. There might be 5 elements here that I will share with you today during this seminar. One of them is, I would say, the beginning, the big picture. What I like to do when I present complex issues is to step back and get a glance at the big picture that we have. And I think it is this big picture that is getting lost at the moment in this heated electoral process, those big trends. Then I want to explain why the Northern Hemisphere is the driver, the source of global instability and conflicts. Europe is currently in a trap. And the rise of multi-aligned nations is making our predicament more difficult. But that also is a chance for corporations and nations that can seize this rise of multi-aligned nations. There is more upside. Challenge America is going to be more painful for its allies and foes, both alike. And this is actually the core of my message today. Of course, if Mrs. Harris wins, it's going to be slightly different as with Mr. Trump winning, but in both cases, and this is the irony of the analysis, the outcome of our analysis, in both cases, Europe is the most affected global power. Finally, I also want to briefly say which sectors I believe are going to do best in Europe. I will be mentioning it during the presentation, some countries and some sectors, but I'm happy to answer in more detail actually during Q&A. Don't forget this. Paramount to our analysis is the fact that all nations advance their interests with all the means at their disposal. And second, something that you need to know, we currently have more alliances than powers. So it's much more complicated than the first Cold War, where you only have 2 sides. All right. Some slides are just for quick illustration. I will not dwell on them. Others are more important. I will dwell on them a bit more. A first message. Looking at the US elections, we have to step back and realize that Europe's geopolitical illiteracy is coming costly. We've always been told, wow, we've got peace in Europe, we've got prosperity in Europe thanks to the EU. I've always disagreed with this. Even as a student, I disagree with this statement because I believe European prosperity has been built on US military protection and later on cheap Russian gas, and for the last 20 years, cheap production and logistics from China. So these 3 pillars, in my opinion, are being eroded as we speak, and there is no easy replacement for that. Remember that our European leaders, university professors, and establishment started to talk about dismantling our military 28 years ago. They've been doing that for the last 24 years, aggressively. They believe that more trade will bring peace. We don't need any military. Now they think that, and now the same people that did that are saying we're going to rebuild the military in 3, 4 years, 5 years. Well, that's not really serious. You cannot rebuild the military in 4 or 5 years. It just shows how much they know about military and defense. Something to start with. Something is happening in the world. The world in 2016 2020. It's not the same. When President Trump was elected, when Brexit took place, Switzerland, Iceland, Austria, Norway, Denmark were the safest countries in the world, the safest. Now the legacy nations are not there. All the top 3 geopolitical safe havens are in the southern hemisphere: Uruguay, Mauritius, New Zealand. And that is a remarkable change. And I think that is already, the world is changing, and not many people, not many investors in Europe are realizing that that investments and portfolio diversification should also adjust to those big changes.
Apologies, Christian. Not sure we can see the slides if you're already sharing.
Yes, I am actually. Oh, wait a second. In that case, a very good point. Thank you. Thank you. I thought I had already done it. It is. I had pressed it. Wait a second. This is an important slide that I was mentioning. I think that Europe needs to improve its geopolitical literacy, especially, our business leadership and political leadership. Because for decades and many years, we're saying it's the EU that is really, thanks to which we have all this prosperity and growth. And I've always been saying it's not the EU. It's, yes, the EU is a very good thing, but the main pillars of our prosperity and growth have been the US military protection, then Russian gas, and also the China effect, the logistics hub, having cheap production in China. So I believe these are the main 3. And sure, the EU has played a positive role, but now that we see that these 3 are being eroded, no longer there, the EU is not much worth. It's not helping that much. So I think we are now confronted with a European continent that is lacking geopolitical literacy, geopolitical knowledge. And this lack of geopolitical knowledge is the reason why I'm cautious for Europe with Mrs. Harris winning or Mr. Trump winning. I was talking about how much has changed in the world in recent years. And I don't want to repeat that, but you can see here, this is the ranking of the most geopolitically safe countries in the world, and the top 3 are now in the southern hemisphere. It's no longer the legacy countries of Europe. And I think this is important to do now, to have a look at global geopolitical trends and also at the macro trends. It is important to realize that most of the stability that we see in the world is emanating from the northern hemisphere, and we will see shortly why. The big shifts are taking place, like the center of Christianity shifting to Asia, Africa, Latin America. Then the inexorable Middle East destabilization. And by the way, this slide here is, we started producing it in 2012. And since 2012, it has barely changed on 3 points. So most of what you see here is the same that I was using in 2015 when we launched our research boutique. Inexorable Middle East destabilization was clearly, it's been there now for 14 years. It's amazing. So this is just happening. These are long-term trends that are worthwhile keeping in mind before we look at US elections. Then there is also the rise of multi-aligned nations, Brazil, India, for example. Yeah, we always think of the West, then Russia, China, and the rest is, countries that should either align with us or with the others. It's not the case. I meet a lot of people talking about geopolitics and the BRICS, and they forget that the BRICS are not the healthiest emerging markets. And second, they forget that most other emerging nations are not non-aligned nations. They are now multi-aligned. They want to be aligned with different powers. They want to do business with America, Europe, Russia, China. That's the new emerging markets. And I think I find very few European politicians and very, very few corporate leaders in Europe that know about this. It's incredible. I think we are geopolitically illiterate in Europe, very much so. Then there is the reset of military alliances. We have more alliances than powers, which is decimating our security. Even within the EU, there are 5 alliances within the EU. I mean, that's incredible. This is why there is so much distrust, right? Like between Paris and Berlin, because they know that they have their own hidden alliances and agendas in the back. What is gonna be unleashed on Europe over the next 4 years, I believe, is paving the way for the rise of a European superstate. A perfect storm is converging over Europe. And I don't think that at the end of that perfect storm, we will see the destruction of the EU. A lot of people wish that, I know. I think that it's rather gonna be the rise of something new, a European superstate or a European federation. Something else that we see also geopolitically is that there is a decline in personal freedoms, free markets, and competition. That is very strong in the West and China. So I think in that sense, the West is converging towards China. Yeah, finally, large-scale wars. We're expecting 3 large-scale wars, big wars. They're coming. And we can say that open hostilities cannot be avoided anymore. They can only be delayed. Let's look at the macro trends now. And I will not I want to go through every one of them, but just the most important ones. Since 1974, we have ongoing fiscal monetary stimulus, gigantic. And we also have the implosion of the labor force across the whole Northern Hemisphere. I'm going to show a slide briefly. That's actually reinforcing the squeeze on real disposable incomes, which in turn is producing political polarization and instability across the whole Northern Hemisphere. And that is one of the big reasons why the United States is what it is today. The United States is being challenged. And I will explain it later on what is happening. These global changes are actually forcing the United States to also experience this same political polarization and destabilization. As you see that in the United States, there is a tough dispute for power. I will explain a bit more later, but that dispute of power makes sure that there is a gridlock within the United States. And if there is a gridlock in the United States, even with the justice systems and the judges, the only place where a US administration can really exercise full power and freedom is in its foreign policy. And being the US now challenged by all these other countries, they also want to deflect into foreign policy. What is the result of that? A very aggressive trade policy, a very aggressive foreign policy. Okay, let's continue. We see the rise of mid-sized emerging economies. This is the biggest thing that I believe is overlooked in Europe, even in investment circles. I made a lot of big banks in Zurich or Geneva, London. They have this bracket, emerging markets. And in this basket, they put everything. It's incredible. Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. They have their Uruguay, Brazil, India, South Africa, Peru in the same basket. I don't know why they do that, but it sells. And it's just not good macroeconomics. It's not even good investing because those countries don't belong in the same basket. They're very, very different. The mid-sized emerging markets are multi-aligned, and they're the reason why things are going the way they're going in the world economy. All right, let's move on. I'm going now a little bit on connecting this geopolitics, the demographics, to the economic reality and the politics of the Northern Hemisphere in the United States. Something happened, as I said, when we started printing money and financing deficits in 1974. And you see that here. Sometime in the 1970s, real GDP began to do very well, but it decoupled from the real weekly earnings, from the real income of people. So you could say that for a vast majority, a lot of people in the middle class, real disposable incomes have not really done so much in the last 20, 40 years, even 50 years. In the meantime, real GDP, trade volumes, and corporate profits went through the roof. But real incomes, disposable real incomes of people, has stagnated, let's put it this way. Sometimes they go up a little bit, they go down. They have overall stagnated, and that's the big thing. Now, if I take the top 1% of earners out of this, if I take the top 1%, it's a decline. So that is actually a challenge. We see here now, our own economic policies, not wanting to have monetary discipline, being able to do stimulus after stimulus, coupled with demographics, creates a very interesting mix, which is what is leading the United States to a place where no matter who wins, he or she can only play hardball, can only really be free to do whatever he wants or she wants in foreign policy or trade policy. So what happens when these economic and geopolitical forces overlap? If you can focus on what is red, it's probably sufficient. Our policymakers are basically pushing up the prices of bonds, stocks, houses, and cars and everything. And what is the result of this massive inflation? Well, we call it prosperity. It's remarkable. I mean, really, I'm not exaggerating. 95% of the bankers, M&A people, financial specialists and analysts and fund managers that I meet look for inflation only within the consumer basket, the CPI basket. Yes, that's how it is. I never talk about other things, but I just keep it in my mind. Only 5% see that inflation is happening everywhere. Inflation is happening everywhere. But the inflation that we have in bonds and stocks, in houses and cars, we look at prosperity. And that's what I call the wealth illusion. We have now a massive wealth illusion, and that's not just in the West, that's not just in the G7, that's also in some G20 countries and in China. The second area is we dismantle in Europe our military, but we also fail to protect our main trading routes, which go through the Middle East. And the problem that the US and Britain have is they are struggling to protect those trade routes. We call it access denial. And finally, something that very few people know here is that, let's put it this way, the competitors of the West, the enemies of the West, can now easily block the trading routes of Europe. They have now 7 countries along our routes. They can easily, overnight, block our trading routes for Europe. That's remarkable. Our trading routes are open, but they can be closed any moment. At the same time, China has finished building the Silk Route connecting Asia with South America. That mega port of Shanghai in Peru is opening in 3 weeks. It's going to change world trade. It's going to change it. It's a massive change. The shipping time is going to be cut by roughly 1/3. In some cases, even more than just 1/3. This is dramatic change. Dear friends, I know that we are a bit focused on Europe, but we have to do our homework. 98% of the people I've met this year knew about this mega port. They knew about the Silk Route between South America and Asia and China, because it's about how to get your resources and how safe is your trading route. So just as China is jeopardizing our trading routes, they go through the Middle East, they are building a very modern, safe, fast trading route for themselves from South America, where they get their resources. But these are resources that we also want. We need the copper. We need the copper from Chile and Peru, but we're not doing much for it. So I just want to say that we are missing the big geopolitical changes here and the big macro changes. 98% of the people that I've met, be it policymakers, government people, officials, corporate leaders, asset managers, fund managers, heads of pension funds in Europe didn't know about this. They don't. And that's the reality in Europe. Many people know this chart. This is GDP in PPP basis, BRICS overtaking the G7. That's not the most important thing. That's not. Everybody's looking at this kind of chart. That's not important. What is important is this. Is looking at who are your partners, who are your allies. You put them all together, because when you want to sanction somebody, when you want to put someone else into an embargo, you will need all your allies. So I calculate the combined West here, and the combined West is 38% of global GDP, in PPP basis. And the emerging markets, and you could say China and its allies, are 59%. Now, this is a chart that I would have liked to show to our NATO leaders and EU leaders in Washington before they decided to use the US dollar and the euro and the SWIFT as a weapon. Because I wanted to tell them, look, you have to explain, you have to have an idea how you're going to go around this. The weight of the West is not what it was 40 years ago, not even 20 years ago or 10 years ago. So this actually is already telling us that we're fighting a geopolitical struggle with wrong information. We're either a little bit too arrogant, or we think we don't need to know these things. But that which we have done with our sanctions recent sanctions on Russia and China are going to be overall counterproductive, because the majority of the world doesn't agree with it, and they can help China or Russia circumvent our sanctions, and they are doing it. Why I have been saying about demographics is not working in our favor. Demographics is actually the one thing we can't change so easily. This chart exists since the year 2015, and it's not been changed since then. This chart is depicting an ODR shock, an old age dependency ratio shock. When the old age dependency ratio, the number of retirees divided by 100 workers or people in the labor force, when that's oscillating between 10 and 20, it's Goldilocks. That's great. Great for the economy, great for investors too. Why? Because we have some old people, but they're not too expensive on us. The moment it starts going over 20, 25, 30, that's painful. That's painful. All of a sudden, incomes, real disposable incomes begin to be squeezed, because the government is going to get the money. Either they're going to get your tax your wealth, tax your income, or increase the VAT. They will get it to you. Or they will raise the double the inheritance tax, whatever. The government can get the money and will get the money. They can just also raise the Krankenkassen premium, the insurance premiums for health, whatever. It doesn't matter. The people pay for it. And what we see across the Northern Hemisphere, China, Korea, Russia, Ukraine, Western Europe, Spain, Italy, the United States, we see that demographics are changing. It's not the more people getting old, it's that the labor force is shrinking too. When both happen at the same time, these ratios begin to shoot up. And in some countries, in this generation, in the generation that we're looking at, they double. In some countries, they triple, like in China. In South Korea, they almost quadruple. These are dramatic changes, dear friends. And we are just in the middle of this process. We have, we have another 15 years of this dramatic change. And during this change, we're going to see increased political instability in the Northern Hemisphere, mass migrations, and an increase in the influence of Russia, China, and the Middle East, Iran on Europe. This chart is unchanged since the year 2015. So the idea that this would generate political instability was very clear to us in 2015. Yeah. And when you have that in your country, more political instability, and people are earning less, I mean, they may earn a little bit more, but the cost of living is higher, it's rising faster, and real disposable incomes are declining or remaining stagnant while prices are going up. What do you get? Political instability. What does every government do? This was done even 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. The government begins to deflect into some foreign conflict, into some other neighbors' problems. You end up having conflicts, foreign policy, aggressive foreign policy. So when you have problems at home, you start focusing on foreign policy. And through foreign policy, you define your administration's term. This is exactly what I've been talking about the last 8 years in the United States. And this is the way you have to look at the thing, I believe. At least from my perspective, a lot of people are looking at the US, interviewing Black people, Latinos. That's important. You have to do that. I like to focus on that which people are not focusing on. And I believe that the global context is actually defining policy already. All right. I will go just very briefly through this. This is China. This is an ODR shock, what it looks like. Other countries look a little bit more benign, but the message is the same, ODR shock. I also mentioned in red are the countries aligned with China and Russia. They have now basically made a massive pincer movement around our trading routes through the Middle East. Our trading routes for Europe can be closed overnight. Overnight. We have 7 nations there. And it's interesting, right, how China and Russia look for their allies. They choose them strategically. Some people told me, oh, I laugh about Sudan. I laugh about it. And I say, okay, very interesting. You can laugh about certain countries, but when you look at the map, those countries can block our trading routes. And look what the Houthis are doing, right? All right. I don't want to dwell too much on that, but just something that you wanted to see. And now this is something that you need to see that there are winners and losers. There are more and more conflicts in the Northern Hemisphere. We've been predicting more conflicts and wars in the Northern Hemisphere since 2015, but that creates winners. Our routes in the Middle East are vulnerable, and they are not going to get better. Panama Canal, also very vulnerable. Look what China has been building. Well, Peru and China have been building a massive mega port in Peru. They can take mega ships with containers with 18,000 to 25,000 containers each. It's gigantic. Those mega ships are already being built. This route will connect the port of Chancay in Peru with the port of Shanghai in China, but also all other ports in Korea, Malaysia, South Korea, Japan, etc. And it's going to cut the shipping time from South America by roughly 30%. From Brazil to China, more than 30%. From many shipping lines, it's going to go from 45 days to 29 days from Brazil. So rather than going to Mexico or Los Angeles, the ships are going to go to Chancay in Peru, and from there, the stuff is going to be put on mega ships and straight to the Far East. This is a big change. These are things that our leaders, our financial business leaders, politicians should know. Again, only 2% of them know. When we predicted there would be more conflicts in the Northern Hemisphere, I didn't know it would be 120 by 2024. But it's amazing. Here are just the biggest ones. The world out there is not a friendly place. What did our leaders say? Free trade will bring, global trade will bring peace. We don't need a military. They're being really wrong. And our universities and media went along with that. Let's pause on that. They're being totally wrong. The difficulty for Europe is we're spending a lot of time following the US electoral process. But the people who are commenting on that, who are shaping our policies, are the same people that decided that 25 years ago and have been supporting the dismantling of our military. The dismantling of our military invited aggression. I think it has done. We predicted it would. Some people could say we even let down Ukraine in that sense. So I think that we're making mistake after mistake, and we have to be very careful about this. I've met a lot of people in Europe, leaders in Europe, that judging from their questions, I tell, man, you seem to be very angry at Mr. Biden, at President Biden. And they told me, I am. Look how the Americans are destroying Europe. Some people in the UK told me the same. And I told them, sir, with due respect, you shouldn't be blaming America. America is simply taking advantage of our own mistakes. It's the duty of every country. And they tell me they never thought it that way, put it that way. So it's important that you realize that something is happening here, and also realize the following. Here comes the military side. The US is giving lip service to NATO, but don't pay attention to that. The US is building, together with the UK, a new, massive, powerful global military alliance. It's called AUKUS. And this military alliance doesn't have any, we say, you know, free riders. I like the name in German better, Trittbrettfahrer. The free riders, they sign a treaty. They don't invest. I mean, they invest a bit in the military, but it's useless. We have in NATO a lot of countries that cannot defend America. They cannot even defend themselves, less so America. They don't even have the political will to defend America. And I always ask myself, what kind of alliance is that? It's an asymmetric alliance. Well, the United States is building now a symmetric alliance, a new global military alliance called AUKUS. And only countries that have a strong military and that want to invest in the military and have the political will to fight and to defend America and American interest, British interest, etc., are going to join. And that's a different kind of military alliance. Just that you keep that in mind, because it's important. And talking about military alliance, the US and the UK have invited Australia. Australia is already a part of it. Australia is going to become a nuclear power. The top three of these military alliances are nuclear powers. And the US and the UK have a credible nuclear deterrence. Have you ever heard of CAST, CSD? This is the US submarine nuclear deterrence. It's powerful. I think that Russia has a lot of respect for the British nuclear submarine deterrence. Now, countries like Canada, Japan, and South Korea want to join AUKUS. And I think there's no doubt why. There are other countries that are being downgraded, and these are European countries, with the slight exception of Romania and Poland. Something else you need to understand. People that will want to blame either Mrs. Harris or President Trump or Mr. Trump for some tough changes in Europe in the next 4 years. We in Europe participated in the Iran deal. We asked Iran for certain things in exchange for protecting their ballistic arsenal development. That ballistic arsenal development has completed its job. The new ballistic missiles of Iran can reach Europe. The new ballistic missiles of Iran can reach Europe. And a few of them were tested on Israel recently. They work. And unlike Israel, we do not have the same amazing, superb air defense ballistic rocket system that Israel has. Israel has 4, depending on how you measure it, 4 to 5 amazing air defense systems. We only have a small one, which is America-owned, US-owned, and Romania and Poland. That's not enough. That is not enough. So I just want to tell you that Europe has a problem. And we will see increasingly how the EU and Europe in general has to do what Iran demands of us, because they will have missiles pointing to us. Those missiles currently are not nuclear tipped, but they will be soon. All right, I'm coming to the end of this presentation because we're doing a global, picture here, big picture, before we go into some statements on US on the US politics. But these are things that I think very few people are talking about. The EU has a big issue or big problem, I think. In Europe, we need 10 trillion US dollars. Yeah, we're talking about 10,000 billion US dollars we need, or maybe let's say 9 trillion euro. And this is mainly coming from our commitments that we have made to several programs, including the NATO, increased NATO payments, but also net zero, right? I think that very few bankers realize how much money Europe wants to invest in net zero. It is $1,600 billion per year until the year 2050. Yes, you didn't hear me wrongly. That is 1,600 billion per year. We don't have that kind of money. I'm not even talking about the hole that we need to, the gap that we have in the, in pensions, social insurance, infrastructure, and other problems. Just talking about net zero. And I put in this chart the size of our EU budget, the size of our NATO commitments. They're small in comparison. So Europe is going to have to mobilize private companies to plug that hole. And that's not going to be enough, because those companies have already done a lot to follow US regulation and to take advantage of subsidies. So we will have to mobilize also private assets, private savings, potentially also pensions. And that is something I believe that very few people talking about. Now, this is related to this capital market union. Okay, now that's not necessarily just negative news. There is also some opportunities here. All these, I believe, are going to be accelerated by a Trump victory. A Trump victory will be a big push for the CMU in Europe. In the case of Mrs. Harris, it will be a little bit less. So we're getting closer to the US elections now, electoral process. I'm going to be finishing with a few slides. And I think it's better that you read this. This is the predicament for businesses in Europe. This is the predicament that our companies have. We're going from managed trade to managed markets to probably a crisis that will lead to super states in Europe. President Macron gave a speech recently in an interview, and what he was saying is exactly this. We've become we've become nations of managed markets. Our markets are managed by the state. As conflicts and wars rise, the main maritime routes between China and Europe will collapse. I believe over the next few years, 10 years, there will be a great normalization. The inflated asset prices will normalize to some extent. So the wealth illusion is going to be corrected. But there is going to be growth. There's going to be significant growth in geopolitically safe economies, mainly emerging markets, young nations, but also in state-led economies. State-led economies are economies that are, kind of gelenkt, they are being managed by the state. And the EU, Europe is one of them. So Europe being a state-led economy is going to benefit from growth, I believe. But this is state-led growth, okay? Not so much private initiative, rather state-led initiative. But it's going to be big and significant. And I expect massive investments in these complexes: defense, security, surveillance, net zero, and something very few people talk about, the CMU, the Capital Market Union. Also the regionalization of supply chains, reconstruction. I also expect significant innovations and breakthroughs. Difficult times, tough times unleash entrepreneurship. I believe we're going to have a wave of innovations and breakthroughs. So the next 4 years are not going to be just suffering. They're going to be, I think, quite some advance out there. I also think the companies are preparing. The companies that I talk to, at least those that come to us, they come to us like, how can we prepare for a reset? How does it look like? And so companies are wanting to prepare for that too. And something that a lot of companies are asking already is where they can diversify or shift. And the companies want to shift to the US, they want to shift to young emerging countries, they also want to shift to Southeast Asia. This is what we hear, okay? And a very important thing is this. When China began to turn against us or getting a bit more difficult, we said we need a backup for China. That is Mexico. Fantastic, Mexico. We didn't do our homework. When people ask me, is Mexico the right place? I says, well, do you know about socialism in Mexico? It's not something that comes and goes. It's very well entrenched. And I told people, I'm happy you have a big factory in Mexico. Good that you're doing so well. But do you know that Mexico has a very strong bias towards China and the BRICS, and that they are on collision course with us in the West? They didn't know that. Only one company that has built big factories and production sites in Mexico knew about that. And I talked to some. It just tells that we do friendshoring superficially. Our friendshoring is not that good, you know. And the problem is not Mexico at all. Mexico hasn't changed at all. Mexico is Mexico. It's us who don't do our homework. Mexico now has announced they will join the BRICS. And you know what that means. All right. I am going to start wrapping up here. And I want you to remember this. Wealth illusion would not exist if it would not be accompanied by other forms of misjudgment, deception, whatever you want to call it. But here in Europe, we have a problem, I think. Our view of, let's say, I'm an emerging market investment specialist, so I know that, and there are other examples, but I will use an example that I know of. Yeah? I will talk of that which I know. The view that we often have of the emerging markets of the rest of the world is the streets of Venezuela, the dilapidated streets of Cuba, unrest maybe in Argentina, people, impoverished in North Korea. That's the picture we want to have of the emerging markets of the rest of the world, developing nations. But dear friends, there are quite a number of healthy, young, emerging economies. I call them the mid-sized economies. They're not the big ones. They are doing very well. And they have monetary fiscal discipline. They have fiscal monetary discipline, unlike us. And they're big, they're not tiny. And these are the kinds of economies that people are now under pressure beginning to discover. And please look here at this chart, debt to GDP ratio. And I am actually doing something with COVID here. These are ex-COVID numbers, okay? Because COVID has created a lot of, strange effects. But look at the fiscal discipline of other nations compared to the G7. The G7, we have 130. Look at the BRICS. Despite having South Africa there, which has a terrible fiscal situation, it's 58%. What I call the top three ASEAN markets in Southeast Asia, they have a 50% debt ratio. The Pacific Alliance of Central South America, the Pacific Alliance has 42. And there are countries like Peru, they have 33%. Dear friends, 33%. Okay? Now that's a country where right before COVID hit, I think Peru had as much foreign exchange reserves at the central bank as the total foreign debt of the country. That is how emerging countries are being disciplined. They are disciplined. We are not. We are not. So, and you have Russia and China. I mean, these two countries have their own problems, but Russia has done one thing. Since the year 2014, they're preparing for war. They're shrinking the economy. They're shrinking what I call the credit part of the economy. They're shrinking consumption credit, consumer debt. By shrinking consumer debt over a number of years, they have made their economy leaner and more ready for a global crisis or war. Okay? And China has done a little bit of the same in recent years. What do we do? What do? We just inflate our economies with a lot of credit and debt. So we are actually, in case of a war and conflict, we are more vulnerable than our main contenders or competitors. All right? Now, that is interesting why I mentioned this, because it just shows to us there are other places where our companies can invest. Corporations and investors in Europe they don't have to invest in Europe, right? Unless they're forced to. but they can also invest elsewhere. And the other thing is, this situation is actually leading America, leading Washington, also to be tougher on other allies, because America needs to attract as much growth, as much investments as possible. So America cannot afford to say, look, we have enough prosperity for everybody here, UK, here, Europe, help yourself. No, it's a tough situation for all of the Western economies. So the pie is getting smaller, and the US cannot afford to share with everybody else. This, I believe, is a situation of an indebted West, an indebted West whose money has been printed already a lot, okay, and where demographics are going against them. And the new nations that are coming up are multi-aligned. So how do you deal with that? This is actually the economic policies and the foreign policy that Washington is showing increasingly in recent years, and I think it's going to accelerate now. All right. Finally, here. What are our economies in Europe looking for? I mean, increasingly, economies and companies in Europe are looking for this. They're looking for places where they can produce. They want to do friendshoring. They have low exposure to major geopolitical conflicts and wars. They have low debt, stable currency, healthy demographics, good infrastructure. Not many countries offer that. Safe trading routes, because our routes are now in danger. Yeah. And they also need resources: water, energy, organic food, copper, gold, iron, etc., zinc, all of the stuff. You can see we in Europe don't meet this criteria. Most of the criteria we don't meet. So we are not really competing for this money. These are other countries. So with this in mind, we have to say this: if America has to sacrifice some allies, it will sacrifice the allies they cannot help with this, isn't it? Yes, I would do that. If I would advise the US government, I would tell them to do that, because we have to be pragmatic. After all, Europe is simply paying for its own mistakes, isn't it? And I finalize with this, but I will talk more about this US electoral process. I will talk about the stuff that other people talk about already, which is more related to the campaigns. But here it is. I received quite a lot of requests to be please specific. I didn't want to do this. I wanted to stay, non-partisan and not going too much into political outcome predictions. But I've received so many messages, and so I am doing this. Until the 10th of October, on our own proprietary model, Mrs. Harris was winning. And since the 11th, President Trump is winning. As of this morning, 10 a.m., our model says President Trump winning. But I want to say this. Also now, we also look at the Congress. The probability of the Republicans taking the House and the Senate are not big. They're 57%. Republican strategists tell me they would prefer to see 62, 63, 64% to feel more confident. The probability of them taking a nice sweep is not as big as they want to. So whoever wins looks like he's gonna face gridlock, okay, at the moment, at this stage. Because also when Harris was leading, the probability of a total sweep was not very significant. So it's very important here. A clean sweep, that would change the landscape in America. But I don't see anybody having a clean sweep at the moment, and not even early October. Without a clean sweep, Harris winning recently, now Trump. But I have to say 10 days. As I was telling Nicolas earlier, 10 days is a long time in 2024. And the situation is more complex than 2016. Yeah. So I'm very open now to any questions and to the moderation by Nicolas. Thank you.
Fantastic presentation. A lot of content covered. Many things indeed I have not stumbled across. Maybe let's start with a question from Christian, and please, everyone, feel free to shoot your question through the Q&A tool. Question to Christian, from Chris. You said there are several alliances at play now. Is it conceivable to reactivate the British Empire's European strategy of divide and rule and apply it to those alliances?
Okay, excuse me. I had a noise here. Can you just repeat the last part of the question, please?
Yeah, is it conceivable to reactivate the British Empire's European strategy of divide and rule and apply it to those alliances that you presented?
Yes. The answer is yes, absolutely. And I think the UK is actually studying that, is being approached on that. Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of times that this is some facts that are hardly known to many politicians. What do you think do you think that's the case, that they don't know, they don't want to discuss certain topics in public? I can give you an example. I noted down. Yeah, when we were talking about the supply routes of strategic investments, creating winners and losers.
Well, it's a very good question. Why don't they react, right? It's like in recent weeks, we see them doing more of the same, actually. Even after Mr. Draghi spoke, there was some reaction in a few countries, even in Germany. The response of some ministers is, we can do more regulation, we can do more. I mean, it is like, even if you show them a tough analysis that something needs to be done, quite a few leaders in Europe think we can do more of the same. And I don't think that they actually have a problem intellectually understanding this. I think this is an issue of close ranks consensus. Something in Europe Europe has a tendency for this, I think. When you study history, this is not the first time that you get a tight close ranks consensus around important issues in Europe. We've had cycles of this repeating itself. I mean, one of my hobbies is history, and Europe is an incredible place to study this because it keeps repeating itself. People say, after the 30-year war, our leader said, never again. Such a disaster, never again. After the 30-year war, what do? We go back to doing alliances again, asymmetric alliances, okay? And dismantling. People have enough of wars, they dismantle. So you have asymmetric alliances and people dismantling. All of a sudden, we end up in war again. One country goes to war with another one, and because of these alliances, everybody goes to war. And what happens in those periods? There is a tight consensus. In the same day we have, I answer this question like this: better an example than 1,000 words. 2018, my research, I sent my research to Germany. After years of trying to warn Germany, I received an invitation. Mr. Takushi, come, we've seen your analysis. If you don't mind, we share with our think tanks, universities. I was welcomed by some leaders of industry and politics in Germany, and they had done their homework. They had sent my analysis to some of the think tanks. They gave me 2 hours to present. I presented, and they told me, it's interesting, sounds very convincing, but we've never heard it before. And by the way, all our think tank presidents, all our analysts, all our experts that we ask unanimously believe this is an interesting analysis. 2 or 3 people say it's even brilliant, but they all agree, Mr. Takushi, war is too much. This will never happen, never. And my warning was, we're relying too much on cheap energy. We're relying too much on China logistics. Our trading routes are vulnerable. And I said, in our time, our logistics are going to collapse. So we have a problem, and Europe sits in a trap, I told them. We sit in a geopolitical economic trap. And they told me, China and Russia will never, ever turn against us, because the experts said this: with global trade, free trade, they will never turn against us. And I told them this is a false understanding of Pareto optimality and trade policy, macroeconomics. Anyway, it was too late. This is interesting. The people that were sitting in the room were very touched by the presentation. They told me that they were convinced by it. They've never heard it before, but they were very convinced. They thought they would like to do something. But they told me that the consensus is so overwhelming. The experts disagree with me. So they have no other choice but to go with the experts. I will never forget that, 2018. And I think this speaks for Europe. We are led by our experts, but our experts themselves, and I know some of those people, our experts are in clubs, echo chambers. I quote you, you quote me. You know how it is in academia.
Yeah.
I quote you, you quote me. We have these dynamics, right? Look at the Nobel Prize winners. The people that received the Nobel Prize, they actually recommend the next Nobel Prize, and they are normally their own students. So we need to break with that. There's enough people out there, not the only one, that have different opinions. They would like to support and contribute constructively, but for some reason, I think our academia and our political process doesn't allow for different voices to be invited to the table. That's it, my view.
Very, very interesting. Thank you for sharing. It seems that all Europe, if I put it this way, is on the losing end, at least featured like that on a couple of your slides. Would you see Switzerland in the same boat, or any exceptions or anything Switzerland is doing better?
Within Europe, Switzerland wins. That's for me very clear. Within Europe, Switzerland is going to benefit at the margin, right? For instance, there are people, when the war in Ukraine started, a lot of people contacted me, Christian, where can I go? But I noticed one thing. 1/3 of the people that were scared about the war moved to Switzerland or bought a place in Switzerland as a backup. 2/3 said, come on, Switzerland is in the middle of Europe. I need to get farther away. So that's interesting. So the interesting thing is our real estate market and banks benefited from 30% of the people that wanted to flee the war. So even in a difficult environment for Europe, Switzerland tends to win at the margin. There are some scenarios, though, where we will not be left out, where we will not be spared. When Europe pushes the CMU, and listen to, hopefully you take it seriously. The CMU, even if they give it a different name, is coming. Europe needs at least 9,000 billion US dollars in the next few years. The money is not there, and we don't have a US dollar as a currency. The only pot that has that money is private savings. They need to open the national capital markets. They need to be merged. That's a great opportunity for some companies. So there's opportunity there. But that also means that some things are going to be changed here. The private investor, private companies, and private savers are going to be asked to, shoulder the cost. And when that happens, I don't think that Switzerland will be spared for too long, because we are a prime target for, if there is a lack of money, we in Switzerland have it. So I think that the rise of a CMU will actually force the EU to put more pressure on Switzerland to bring Switzerland into a bilateral agreement. That's my answer to it.
Interesting. Thank you very much. And you mentioned Ukraine and Switzerland partially benefiting from that. What's your view? How will the war end? Will it end? What's your view on Ukraine-Russian conflict?
For the sake of time, there are some parties involved with this that are benefiting quite well from the current conflict, which is one concern that we had at the beginning. Once you start a conflict, there are winning parties there. So those winning parties have a say in the whole process, and they're delaying that. But there are other parties like Romania on the side that could benefit tremendously if the war comes to an end, right? There are several scenarios depending on who wins, okay? This is another talk. Depending on who wins, there's some scenarios. I think if President Trump wins, the war is coming to an end rather soon than if Mrs. Harris wins. And if it's rather soon, it's likely that Russia will keep what they have. I mean, whatever they've been able to defend, they will be able to keep. And I think it's going to be a dirty solution for Ukraine. It's going to be a dirty solution. But some people may argue better that than the further loss of life, which is absolutely tragic. The other problem is Europe doesn't have the money to keep sustaining this war effort. We don't have the money. We're not the United States. So the longer this war goes on, the deeper the financial crisis of Europe. We have a financing budget crisis in Europe. The good thing is we're not talking about it, so nobody's scared, but we have one. And we are not talking about it because we're focusing now on Ukraine and the US elections. But I think that giving all these scenarios on the table, the more likely one at the moment is of a truce, a kind of armistice, where nobody really wins, an armistice where nobody really wins, a dirty solution, a kind of transition that de facto gives Russia what they need and de facto gives Ukraine some kind of new beginning. It is what it is, I believe. And, nobody's going to be really happy with it.
Thank you for sharing. Very interesting. And indeed, we are a bit over time. I wanted to take one last question before I do the closing. Different angle, but which do you think, will China be able to compete with the US given its population stress, aging? And is troubled Europe a positive scenario for the US home market?
The last part only. The last part. The first part about China, I got it very well. And in Europe,
is the troubled Europe a positive scenario for the US home market?
Yeah, well, I think that China can do that. Yeah, China knows about its decline in demographics, and that's why they've been very smartly trying to invest and win the hearts of young nations that are fiscally, monetarily healthy. It's very smart what they're doing. So yes, China is basically docking onto nations. They have the young people, they have stable currencies, they have the resources, safe ports, big ports. That's what they're doing. It's very smart. Yes, China can do it. And they are doing it. And on the other question, I think that the United States is the biggest beneficiary of what's going on in Europe, by far, the biggest beneficiary. And this is why I think it's difficult to see that Mrs. Harris or Mrs. Trump will want to stop it. Why would they? Let's call it this Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, when Trump was president, right, he talked so badly. He was tough on Europe. He was tough on us. Trump was tough on us. But nothing that Trump said was as bad for Europe than the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act is World War III on Europe. And I think that we have to understand that. Trump does the talk, but Biden does the work. So I have to say, please, don't worry too much. I mean, if you're in Idaho, if you are in Nevada, in the US, you got a point. It matters who wins. I mean, if you are in those states, it really matters, especially Arizona. It matters for you a lot who is the next president. But if you are in Europe and you're an investor, please look at the things that both administrations are going to advance, because it's in the best interest of the United States of America. And don't blame America when it comes. I think that we have put ourselves in this situation, and it's going to be very hard for a US president not to take advantage of that or continue that.
With that, we will close here. Thank you very much, Christian, and very much as well for your bold views and which I would say a little bit off the mainstream. And I would also like to thank the audience for their participation via the Q&A tool and also the questions sent up front, sort of forcing Christian to take a view or present his view at the end here. Yeah. And as mentioned at the beginning, the recording of this webinar will be presented afterwards, so you can delve deeper. There were lots of tips of the iceberg that were shown, and I think there's a lot of material to do deep dives, and for this you can use the survey tool. We pasted the link into the chat. It takes 2 minutes, and it's a huge help for us. Other topics, any things to improve, but also topics you would like to hear more from Christian. And finally, please don't forget to check our website, subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on LinkedIn, and hope to see you in one of our face-to-face events, and especially the annual dinner in Geneva.
Oh, yes.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nicholas.